Buenos días, gracias por su asistencia, a los pocos asistentes que están aquí, pero esperemos que lleguen más personas. Estamos aquí para inaugurar o presentar el seminario, que es más bien como un taller, una charla, una conversación con dos ponentes que vienen de Estados Unidos, que nos visitan ahora. Ahora voy a hacer la presentación de Urmi Engineer Willoughby, que es quien nos está visitando ahorita y va a ser comentada por el doctor Humberto Urquiza y Christopher Willoughby, que también de Estados Unidos, y que va a ser comentado por Emily Vazquez, la doctora Emily Vazquez. Entonces, ahorita vamos a hacer la presentación de Urmi. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Thank you for being here. So, la presentación de ellos va a ser en inglés, y los comentarios de Humberto van a ser en español. Vamos a hacer un tipo de intercambios en Spanglish en algún momento, y bueno, vamos a empezar. Urmi Engineer es profesor de historia en la Murray State University. Hizo su doctorado en la Universidad de California, Santa Cruz, y tuvo una beca postdoctoral en el Colby College y en la Universidad en el History Center Pittsburgh World History Center. Se acerca a la historia de la enfermedad y la medicina desde una perspectiva ecológica y global, y su investigación se enfoca principalmente en la ecología del Valle del Mississippi, la parte sur del Golfo de México y el Caribe, y traza conexiones entre los Estados Unidos, el Atlántico colonial y el sureste de Asia. Su libro, Yellow Fever, Race and Ecology in 19th-Century New Orleans, que podría ser traducido como Fiebre amarilla, raza y ecología en el siglo XIX en Nueva Orleans, fue publicado en la Louisiana University Press, y ganó el premio del 2017, el premio Williams de 2017 para mejor libro en la historia de Luisiana. Este libro estudia las conexiones medioambientales, sociales y culturales de la fiebre amarilla y de las epidemias de fiebre amarilla en Nueva Orleans desde una perspectiva global. Sus otros estudios de investigación inciden en la ecología de la malaria en el Valle del Mississippi. Agradecemos la participación también de personas que están visitándonos por internet, que espero que nos hagan preguntas por ahí. Creo que se puede hacer preguntas en línea. Y a la organización del centro, a Patti, a Gaby y a Gladys por la participación, al centro en sí. Y me presento yo, soy Joel Vargas, soy el organizador. Se me olvidó que soy yo. Estoy haciendo una estancia postdoctoral aquí en el centro, y pues bueno, agradecemos la presencia. Muchas gracias. Y le damos la presencia a Urmi para que haga su presentación. Vamos a presentar la presentación de PowerPoint. Nosotros nos vamos a mover para que ya quede aquí y presente. Thank you very much. I can help you with the slide presentation. You can do it. We can move so she can present. Do you want? ¿Quieres quedarte aquí, Humberto? Si quieres. No, a mí, tú dime donde quieras. No, donde quieras, no hay mucho protocolo. So, you want me to help you with the slides?
Sure, so I don't have to keep…
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Joel, and thank you, Humberto, for reading my paper, and thank you to everyone in the audience for coming today. In the early decades of the 19th century, yellow fever became seasonally endemic in New Orleans. Yellow fever is caused by a virus of West African origin, and it's carried by mosquitoes that are indigenous to tropical Africa. While temperate cities along the Atlantic seaboard suffered from numerous yellow fever epidemics in the late 18th century, New Orleans remained free of severe outbreaks. The city experienced its first epidemic in 1796, and epidemics occurred frequently after 1817 as a result of ecological changes tied to its growth as a slave society with large sugar plantations. My book traces the history of the rise and fall of yellow fever in New Orleans from the first epidemic in 1796 through the last epidemic in 1905. The frequency of epidemics increased from 1817 until the Civil War. Today I'm going to talk about the first two chapters of the book, and in those chapters I outline how the disease grew to be endemic in the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Gulf Coast of North America in the 17th through 19th centuries. So actually, I sent you the first two chapters, but I'm going to focus on chapter 2 and 3 today. Chapter 2 is called Sugar Fever, and it traces the history of the rise of yellow fever in New Orleans. First, I focus on the ecological history of how the disease became a major presence in the city. And second, I study changing attitudes about yellow fever immunity in medical and popular culture. So these are the two main arguments of these chapters. The first is about how the built environment of New Orleans enabled yellow fever to spread. Usually historians frame the rise of African fevers in the Americas as a consequence of the Atlantic slave trade, which introduced African slaves, mosquitoes, and pathogens to the tropical Americas. However, the story is more complicated. The era of yellow fever epidemics in New Orleans was the result of complex ecological factors tied to the growth of plantations and cities in addition to slavery. The second part of my research is a cultural study of medical ideas about yellow fever immunity. In New Orleans, ideas about immunity and resistance were tied to ideas about race and identity, and how doctors and other residents changed they changed their ideas about immunity over the course of the 19th century. For most of the 19th century, residents of New Orleans and visitors to New Orleans hardly feared anything more than yellow fever. Hundreds of doctors wrote about and sketched detailed descriptions of the symptoms. In order to understand how and why yellow fever plagued the city in the 19th century, I'll give you a quick overview of some of the relevant details about the disease. Symptoms of yellow fever range from mild to severe and occur in two distinct phases. The first phase is often described as mild. Victims experience a sudden onset of head and body aches, nausea, and chills. The second phase is the severe or toxic phase, and within days, victims will ooze blood through their external orifices. They will experience severe pain and vomit partially coagulated blood. This is the telltale symptom of yellow fever, known as black vomit, or vomito negro, which doctors often described as being of the consistency of coffee grounds. There still is no effective treatment for yellow fever. Helpless doctors in the 19th century watched as patients lapsed into comas and then died. Thus, the luckiest people contracted milder flu-like cases when they were children, and as a result acquired lifelong immunity. Overall, mortality rates during epidemics ranged from 10 to 50%. Yellow fever is a virus, as I said, carried by the female Aedes aegypti mosquito. This particular mosquito prefers to breed in clean water vessels, typically found in cities, wells, cisterns, and open barrels. Entomologists have described Aedes aegypti as an urban species that has proved to be remarkably adaptable to living close to humans, thriving in their cities, and by changing its preferred blood meal to human blood and breeding in artificial containers. New Orleans provided the ideal conditions for yellow fever in the 19th century. The city had a large mosquito population and a rapidly growing non-immune human population to host the virus. Next slide, please. New Orleans was part of what I call the Greater Gulf Coast region. It's a network that was centered in the Caribbean, but connected the Gulf South to this trade system of the Atlantic world. Throughout the 18th century, French colonial sources described the general presence of disease and vaguely described fevers in Louisiana, noting that disease was most prevalent during the summer. French sugar prospectors believed that Louisiana was healthier than the Caribbean colonies, Florida, and the Carolina Low Country. The first documented outbreak of yellow fever in New Orleans occurred in the summer of 1796, a few years after the famous epidemics in Philadelphia and New York. Epidemics in 1796 and 1797 coincided with a major canal building project that was aimed to connect the French Old City to Bayou St. John. And you can go to the next slide. And here in this map, you can see more clearly the plan to develop New Orleans by expanding into the surrounding wetlands. A series of ecological transformations fostered the growth of yellow fever epidemics in the 19th century, and this included both environmental and demographic changes. The simultaneous rise of sugar and yellow fever was not a coincidence. The establishment of sugar plantations required severe changes to the landscape, which facilitated the growth of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes in several ways. First, plantations caused heavy deforestation, as planters cleared land for cultivation and used wood to fuel sugar mills. The clearing of forests resulted in the eradication or near eradication of numerous animal species, particularly those that lived in the forest canopy, including rodents, bats, and birds which fed on insects. Second, sugar planters altered the landscape through several types of water management projects, including the construction of drainage ditches and canals, which were necessary to keep sugar crops from flooding. Planters ordered slaves and hired laborers to dig ditches and canals and to reinforce natural levee lands by building artificial levees. The process of clearing and developing swamps for settlements and cultivation created a niche for Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. And as a result, slaves and immigrants who worked as ditchers and delvers encountered both Aedes aegypti mosquitoes and also Anopheles mosquitoes, and were exposed to both malaria and yellow fever. Since most European newcomers didn't have contact with these fevers before they immigrated to Louisiana, they were particularly susceptible and subsequently died in large numbers during epidemics. Third, plantations created a sustainable breeding environment for mosquitoes. Next slide, please. They usually had an abundance of cisterns, water barrels, and clay pots, which collected fresh water, providing ample spaces for mosquitoes to lay eggs. Finally, sugar plantations provided nourishment, next slide, please, in the form of sucrose. Entomologists have shown that Aedes aegypti are especially attracted to sweet fluids, and adding sucrose to their diet increases the lifespan of Aedes aegypti. Sucrose was available throughout the year on sugar plantations in various forms, on discarded sugarcane called bagasse, in vats that held boiling cane juice, and in the runoff from clay pots that held crystallized sugar. Additionally, sugar was available on docks, harbors, and ships in wooden sugar barrels that were used to store sugar for export. The establishment of sugar plantations, combined with demographic changes resulting from the rise of sugar production, enabled the emergence of a fever zone. From 1796 to about 1820, several waves of Caribbean migrants arrived in New Orleans due to the Haitian Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. After the Haitian Revolution, tens of thousands of refugees, primarily French and Creole planters, including whites and people of color, fled Haiti after the revolution. Some returned to France, but thousands fled to American port cities for refuge, including New York, Philadelphia, and New Orleans. And in fact, the famous yellow fever epidemics of Philadelphia and New York in 1793 were introduced by vessels from the Caribbean, from refugees of Saint-Domingue. From 1796 to 1820, most newcomers to New Orleans arrived from these regions and thus had been exposed to yellow fever before they arrived in New Orleans. During the American period, immigration patterns changed. Sugar production grew during this period, and there were a number of technical innovations that enabled Louisiana planters to start producing large quantities of sugar and to compete with Caribbean producers. This caused New Orleans to emerge as an active commercial center in the Atlantic world. New Orleans grew as an urban port city surrounded by sugar plantations. As a result of its growing economic and political importance, the city attracted thousands of prospective planters and urban migrants. Between 1803 and 1830, the city's population grew from roughly 8,000 to 50,000. The demography of the region, the next one. Yeah, thanks. The demography of the region changed after the United States purchased the territory and created the state of Louisiana in 1812 with its capital at New Orleans. Tens of thousands of Anglo-American migrants settled in this region after the Louisiana Purchase. These newcomers included planters and slaves who had previously grown cotton, tobacco, indigo, and rice in the southern United States. Upon arriving in Louisiana, they built sugar plantations north of New Orleans along the Mississippi's natural levees. In addition, in the 1830s and 40s, a growing number of German, Italian, and Irish immigrants settled in the city. So demographic changes after about 1817 increased the likelihood of yellow fever epidemics as European and American migrants provided a sizable population of non-immune individuals to host the disease. During the previous waves of immigration, presumably refugee planters and slaves native to Saint-Domingue and Cuba had encountered yellow fever before they arrived in Louisiana. The next slide. Yellow fever epidemics occurred with more frequency after 1817 as the disease spread to regions connected to the Port of New Orleans by rivers, canals, and railroads. The expansion of Louisiana's sugar industry in the 1820s through the 1850s rapidly transformed New Orleans into an active entrepot due to increased port traffic, which intensified due to new steam-powered technologies. By the 1850s, the impacts of the growth of steam traffic intensified along New Orleans' waterfront, known as the levee. The development of New Orleans waterfront as an urban public space, combined with increased port traffic, provided a large supply of human blood and desirable breeding spaces for Aedes aegypti, and further increased their likelihood of exposure to the yellow fever virus. These changes generated rapid demographic growth during this period as a number of newcomers arrived from the eastern United States and Europe. Alongside the construction of levees and canals, the city expanded and built residential and commercial districts by draining the land around the old city. Suburban development created additional spaces for Aedes aegypti to breed in structures such as architectural ornamentation that adorned homes, gardens, and cemeteries. The growth of the city and the increase of yellow fever epidemics led to an increase in deaths and a growing need for cemeteries. New Orleans cemeteries were often called cities of the dead, and they contained a variety of monuments, including marble vases, urns, and other kinds of ornamentation that filled with stagnant water when it rained. Cemeteries are a very distinctive feature of, these above-ground cemeteries are a very distinctive feature of New Orleans' urban landscape. And in the 1830s and 1840s, modest tombs began to give way to more elegant and expensive monuments to show family prestige, status, and fashion. So thus, ironically, the growth of cemeteries contributed to the prevalence of yellow fever by presenting an inviting locale for Aedes aegypti to live and breed. So as I've tried to show quickly here, yellow fever epidemics were by no means a natural disaster. The warm, wet climate was not enough to cause the promulgation of Aedes aegypti and the yellow fever virus. Changes to the landscape and human migrations allowed the mosquito and the virus to thrive in the growing metropolis. I'm going to switch gears now and turn to think about how residents and doctors in New Orleans understood the growing frequency of yellow fever epidemics. The simultaneous growth of sugar plantations, slavery, and an endemic fever zone around the expanding city shaped local ideas about health, disease, and the environment as doctors drew connections between race, immunity, and climate. During the early 19th century, the dominant framework for understanding disease could be described as environmental. Rather than searching for microscopic causes of disease, doctors understood illness as a result of complex and interrelated environmental variables, including climate, latitude, topography, soil conditions, temperature, rainfall, changes in seasons, and other meteorological events. This view was common among European colonial doctors who practiced in tropical regions, as well as those who practiced in the Gulf South. they often drew connections between ecological patterns and diseases that they linked to warm climates, particularly fevers. Doctors associated disease with atmospheric conditions and theorized that fevers were caused by local foul airs or miasmas, which they believed emanated from swamps and decomposing matter. In the urban environment of New Orleans, doctors were especially concerned with filth, an ambiguous term that they used to refer to organic waste that accumulated in cities. This is an image from a prominent local physician, E.H. Barton, a professor at the Medical College of Louisiana, which is now Tulane University. He served as president of the Louisiana Medical Association in the 1850s. His map here depicts various, quote, nuisances and other causes that he associated with yellow fever, cholera, and other diseases, including railroads, canals, drains, ditches, buildings, and water and gas lines. In addition to drawing connections between the environment and disease, antebellum medical authorities developed notions of disease immunity and resistance based on factors including creolism, a term in the 19th century that was generally understood to mean nativity to New Orleans, creolism, and race, in addition to categories of class, age, gender, as well as social behaviors. Between 1820 and the Civil War, New Orleanians described the presence of yellow fever during what they called the sickly season, which usually fell between July and October. As yellow fever epidemics broke out nearly every year between 1817 and 1857, residents grew accustomed to the presence of the disease in the city each summer. Until the 1850s, most New Orleanians believed that Creoles or natives were immune to fever, regardless of their racial or ethnic identity. They viewed yellow fever as a, quote, stranger's disease, next slide, because the majority of its victims were newcomers or strangers, particularly European immigrants and migrants from the eastern United States, who attributed their vulnerability to their status as strangers. Most physicians agreed that Creoles and long-term residents of New Orleans seemed to enjoy some sort of immunity, especially compared to newcomers from both Europe and the East Coast. In addition to nativity, local medical authorities believed that individuals obtained immunity by undergoing a process that they called acclimation or acclimatization or seasoning, which current researchers describe as acquired immunity. For example, physician P.H. Lewis of Mobile, Alabama, wrote that, quote, natives and those who have long resided in Mobile or New Orleans are equally exempt with those similarly situated in the West Indies. Local medical authorities debated about whether immunity could be acquired by long-term residents. Some viewed long-term residents as a process of acclimation or seasoning, and others insisted that immunity could only be acquired by surviving the disease. For example, New Orleans physician Bennett Dowler argued that, quote, long urban residence is, in a sanitary sense, an equivalent to nativity among the people of the city. It is a kind of naturalization, or rather creolization. E.H. Barton, whose map I showed you earlier, accurately pointed out that although yellow fever was known as the Great Acclimating Fever, the term acclimation was imprecise, and immunity was not a definite result of long-term residence in the city, but rather an effect of surviving the disease. Third physician, E.D. Fenner, was more ambivalent. He explained that, quote, acclimation may be attained without sickness, but generally it requires the endurance of one or more spells of customary endemic fevers. However, he also noted that, quote, Creoles or natives to New Orleans may have yellow fever, though generally they have it in a very mild form. By the 1830s, Irish and German immigrants comprised the majority of newcomers in New Orleans. More immigrants than Anglo-American migrants settled in the city during these years. The high percentage of yellow fever victims among the European immigrant population can be attributed to their status as non-immunes, combined with their socioeconomic condition and the city's ethnic geography. First, since the majority of immigrants who came from Europe had probably never encountered the virus during childhood, they didn't have a chance to acquire immunity. Second, the living and working conditions of immigrants made them more likely to be exposed to infected mosquitoes. The city's ethnic geography contributed to the increased exposure of immigrants to yellow fever, particularly those who worked in construction. Affluent families occupied the elevated sections of the city, while middle and working class families lived in the back swamp. Areas farthest from the river were lowest in elevation and thus prone to flooding and mosquitoes. This so-called back of town suffered environmental risks and primitive infrastructure and cost very little. Thus, immigrants who arrived in New Orleans during the 1820s through the 1850s lived and worked in these lowland areas where they found both affordable housing and employment at flatboat wharves, warehouses, slaughterhouses, tanneries, and other public works projects for canals, drainage, and railroads. During the 1850s, many medical professionals in New Orleans abandoned previous notions of Creole immunity or acclimation and began to emphasize race as a factor in determining yellow fever resistance. These ideas were especially evident during the epidemic of 1853, the most horrific epidemic that the city had yet experienced. After the epidemic, some local physicians noticed that many victims were Black, but they began to question their previously held notions of acclimation and immunity. However, they maintained a race-based ideology of yellow fever resistance dependent on an individual's degree of African ancestry. For example, E.D. Fenner reported that, quote, the epidemic of 1853 affected unacclimated Negroes of those who had never had yellow fever before equally and generally as it did the white population, though not so severely. This difference between the Black and mulatto must proceed from the mixture of races. By the 1850s, prominent racial scientists of the antebellum period argued that differential immunity was proof of biological racial differences. One of the most influential racial theorists in the Gulf South, you can click a couple more. One of the most influential racial theorists, Cartwright, who practiced medicine in Natchez and New Orleans. In his assessment of the unusually high numbers of Black victims that he witnessed in the epidemic of 1853, he claimed that they died from, quote, panic rather than yellow fever. He reasoned that, quote, experience and observation prove that panic is very apt to kill a Negro, but it is questionable whether the yellow fever per se has that power. Josiah Nott, another prominent local medical researcher and racial theorist, believed that, quote, the smallest admixture of Negro blood, as in the quarteroon or quinteroon, is great, though not absolute protection against yellow fever. In his lengthy study on climate, race, and disease, he concluded, quote, I hazard nothing in the assertion that 1/4 Negro blood is a more perfect protection against yellow fever than is vaccine against smallpox. This sentiment became common in both medical and popular depictions of yellow fever immunity that appeared after 1853 as racial tensions and the conflict over slavery through the Civil War and post-war era. Late 19th century and 20th century historical accounts continue to echo this idea by linking race and yellow fever resistance. So as I've shown today, the history of yellow fever in New Orleans reveals the unintended and unforeseen ecological consequences of human endeavors, which in turn affect the intellectual and cultural understandings of disease and the environment. In New Orleans, environmental changes had a profound impact on the city's epidemiological history, and these changes shaped local attitudes about race, health, and the environment. By situating New Orleans in multiple contexts, as a unique urban space shaped by its geography and climate, as a plantation society in the greater Caribbean, and as an entrepot that linked the Mississippi Valley to the Atlantic world, we can see simultaneously the distinctiveness of New Orleans in U.S. history, as well as the city's shared history with ports in the Caribbean, Mexico, and Central America. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Damos la palabra al doctor Humberto Urquiza del Centro de Investigaciones para América Latina y el Caribe, y que él va a hacer un comentario al texto de Urmi Willoughby y bueno, le damos la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, en primer lugar, quiero agradecer al doctor Vargas por la invitación a este evento, a comentar el libro de Urmi, y pues al público que asiste. Yo había preparado un pequeño texto, pero debido a las condiciones en las cuales nos encontramos, voy a intentar, apoyándome en las ideas que desarrollé en el texto, exponer más que nada algunas cuestiones que me parecen importantes del trabajo de Urmi. En primer lugar, yo soy un historiador ambiental, ¿no? Y con esos ojos hago la lectura de este tipo de textos. Y encuentro una conexión muy clara, casi pristina, ¿no?, entre la tradición que se ha venido desarrollando y los trabajos de historia ambiental desde los años 70 con, por ejemplo, los textos de Alfred Crosby, ¿no?, la cuestión de las epidemias, ¿no?, cómo hay intercambios transoceánicos desde que empezaron las grandes migraciones de nuevos visitantes o nuevos colonizadores a estas tierras. También veo una conexión directa con los trabajos de los McNeill, ¿no?, el cual está también presente en la bibliografía del texto, ¿no? El trabajo pionero del doctor McNeill es el que considero yo que le da varias pautas a la doctora Urmi para ampliar lo que yo entiendo como una historia que, aunque se sitúe en un punto específico del hoy territorio norteamericano, es parte de una historia global, ¿no? Una historia global, y eso es una de las cuestiones mucho más ricas del capítulo que a mí me tocó leer. Otra cosa que creo importante, y yo creo que cada vez estamos menos acostumbrados los historiadores a este tipo de trabajos, es hacer historias de periodos largos, ¿no?, de más de 10 años. El libro hace, o bueno, por lo menos a lo que yo he podido tener acceso, hace una historia de un siglo, ¿no? Cada vez hacemos menos historias de larga duración y nos estamos enfocando a periodos extremadamente cortos, los cuales no nos permiten tener un panorama amplio de qué es lo que está pasando y las transformaciones que se están dando en los paisajes, en los ecosistemas. Y yo creo que esa es otra de las grandes virtudes del texto de la doctora. Otro aspecto fundamental, yo como latinoamericanista, es la conexión que encuentra en la historia de lo que se conoce como el Circuncaribe. Cómo logra conectar la historia de las plantaciones azucareras en las islas del Circuncaribe, ¿no? Para lo cual existen excelentes trabajos que también están referidos en su bibliografía, como los del doctor Reinaldo Funes Monzonte, ¿no?, que nos explica cómo se dieron las cuestiones de plantación y la desforestación de la caña de azúcar en Cuba y cómo la doctora Urmi logra conectar esta parte también que es un paradigma en las revueltas y las revoluciones latinoamericanas, que es la independencia de Haití, ¿no? Cómo logra conectar la migración que se da en Haití después de la revolución con un elemento o el elemento central del texto, que es la cuestión de la fiebre amarilla. La división que hace en los subapartados del capítulo que a mí me toca comentar, creo que es adecuada porque nos va mostrando cómo se va transformando el paisaje y cuáles son los elementos centrales de la transformación del paisaje. A mí hay una parte que me gustó muchísimo, que le introduce desde el inicio de su trabajo, que es la referencia que hace al cuerpo de ingenieros norteamericanos, ¿no? Que dice que en un informe de 1958, el Cuerpo de Ingenieros del Ejército de los Estados Unidos, donde participaban los geógrafos Klopp y Van Lopkip, llamaron a este medio ambiente una tierra entre el mar, entre la tierra y el mar, que no pertenece a ninguno de ellos y que es reclamada alternativamente por ambos, ¿no? Esto me llamó muchísimo la atención porque yo hace aproximadamente 10 años, cuando inicié mis labores de investigación, el primer proyecto donde me contrataron para trabajar fue en la UAM Azcapotzalco, y a mí me tocó desarrollar la parte de todo el proyecto que se desarrolló por parte del Tennessee Valley Authority, ¿no? Toda la cuestión de cómo los ingenieros en Estados Unidos y el gobierno norteamericano fue desarrollando una serie de proyectos ingenieriles que, además de intentar desarrollar ciertos aspectos ingenieriles para la control del Tennessee Valley, también iban enfocados a romper la dinámica que conocemos como del subdesarrollo de ciertas comunidades y lograr también salir o como resorte para el desarrollo para intentar. Otro elemento que me llamó la atención, y aunque no es un ambiente similar, pero recordó mucho a lo que es la cuenca del Valle de México, por otro argumento que nos da la doctora, que es que uno de los aspectos con los que siempre ha tenido que lidiar Nueva Orleans es la cuestión de las inundaciones. La Ciudad de México también sufre históricamente de este problema, ¿no? Entonces, en ese, pues, uno se conecta y piensa, por ejemplo, en fenómenos que acontecieron ambientales hace pues ya un poco más de una década, con el terrible huracán Katrina que azotó la ciudad de Nueva Orleans. Pensar Nueva Orleans desde la perspectiva de epidemias como la fiebre amarilla, pues nos quita un poco esta imagen romántica de la ciudad del jazz, ¿no? Donde pues ve otro tipo de cuestiones. En México no estamos, aunque hemos empezado a trabajar algunos aspectos de la historia ambiental, nos hace mucha falta empezar a ver este tipo de problemas. Por ejemplo, estuve revisando algunas cuestiones en el puerto de Veracruz después de haber leído este capítulo, y justamente el puerto de Veracruz, uno de los principales frenos que tuvo para su construcción fueron las epidemias de vómito negro, ¿no? A tal grado que entre 1905 y 1902, ingenieros y vamos a la laguna de Veracruz justamente para lograr contener pues, las epidemias de fiebre amarilla. Entonces, el libro o el capítulo que a mí me tocó leer la doctora Urmi me abre muchísimas preguntas también, y que me ayudan a pensar algunas cuestiones de la historia. Faltan todas hacer si se tendrá con mucho más fuerza en los próximos años, como es el medio ambiente y las epidemias, en este caso importantes, por ejemplo, de cómo se fueron dando las cuestiones o cómo se fueron resolviendo las cuestiones de epidemias en la zona de Morelos, que la tenemos aquí a menos de 80 kilómetros, donde se desarrollaron grandes proyectos de plantación de caña de azúcar. ¿Cómo en un lugar tan próximo o cómo se dieron este tipo de casos? Porque también busqué y si hay registros de que hubo amarilla en Morelos, ¿no? No los hemos estudiado. Hay esfuerzos que ya se han hecho por parte del CIESA, gente que tiene bastante grupo de investigación en el CIESAS, y por parte del doctor Flores Cano, de ir delineando algunas de las cuestiones de enfermedades de este tipo y cómo se pueden estudiar desde la historia. El capítulo es extremadamente sencillo en la lectura, pero me imagino como historiador lo complejo que debió haber sido para la doctora habernos facilitado un proceso que es altamente complejo. La división que ella hace es muy clara para alcanzar este objetivo. Y logra conectar distintos aspectos que vienen, formas de hacer historia, para dar una visión ambiental del proceso, desde la historia ambiental. Uno de los elementos que yo considero que son también muy importantes es el cambio que ella observa a nivel tecnológico. Cuando nos da cómo se van dando los cambios en las distintas variedades de caña de azúcar que fueron implementando, ¿no? Alcanzar una producción competitiva en los mercados mundiales del azúcar, uno logra también conectar con otras historias que son también locales. Por ejemplo, el doctor Horacio Crespo, que tiene una historia del azúcar en México, como también se experimentaron con distintas variedades de azúcar. Entonces, esta parte de cómo los cambios tecnológicos también ayudaron a el desarrollo de la industria azucarera es una parte fundamental también para hacer la historia ambiental y nos una conexión entre y la historia ambiental, porque es a partir de la tecnología que el ser humano ha ido transformando, manipulando y explotando el medio ambiente y generando una serie de nuevos entornos, los cuales a veces nos benefician y a veces nos perjudican como y comunidad biológica. Entonces eso me parece importantísimo. Hay un aspecto que también creo que a mí me hubiera gustado ver el texto, aunque fuera solamente delineado o explicado en una nota al pie. Un elemento que es fundamental también para entender los procesos de cambio, de evolución en los ecosistemas o en los paisajes que habitamos, que es el consumo de, y que es un elemento que pone mucho énfasis en su documento, porque según el argumento que la doctora expone es que uno de los elementos que nos permiten explicar el incremento de las epidemias de fiebre amarilla en la ciudad de Nueva Orleans es el cambio tecnológico que se da a partir de toda la cuestión del desarrollo del vapor, ¿no? de la maquinaria. Y es una pregunta que yo le quiero hacer, porque como no he podido tener acceso al libro, ¿no? O sea, nada más nos dieron un pedacito del pasado, pues ya queremos es tenerlo completo, porque pues si no la historia no nos queda totalmente un reclamo, porque no, ¿no? Si lo que quería era que lo compráramos, nos hubiera dicho, está en Amazon en tal lado, adquieran el libro, y yo lo hubiera adquirido con todo gusto, doctora. No lo hemos encontrado. Espero que traiga algunos ejemplares para la venta aquí y podamos incluirlo próximo semestre en la bibliografía de nuestros cursos. Y esa es una pregunta. Energía, no en el sentido de la de la energía, sino cuál era el energético que utilizaba la industria, porque, por ejemplo, Reinaldo Funes Monzonte nos dice que en Cuba el carbón era el combustible que se utilizaba en los trapichos y en todas las haciendas de beneficios azucareras. Me gustaría saber si en Nueva Orleans, la industria azucarera que se asentó en Nueva Orleans, ¿no? La base energética también fue la madera. O los bosques, porque sí hay una diferencia muy puntual entre el carbón mineral y el carbón vegetal, ¿no? Porque imagínense la gran cantidad de industrias azucareras y en el Mississippi con carbón vegetal. Eso nos puede dar una perspectiva mucho más de las transformaciones ambientales, porque el desmonte de los bosques para la ampliación de la frontera agrícola, en este caso de la caña de azúcar, pero también eso sumado a las necesidades energéticas del consumo de la población y de la industria, también nos permite ver el grado y la intensidad de las modificaciones del paisaje que se dieron. Entonces, el elemento del metabolismo social, ¿no? La incorporación de materiales y energía en los procesos de transformación de los paisajes es algo que nos podría dejar mucho más clara la parte de las transformaciones del paisaje, que es a lo que usted atribuye, ¿no?, explosión de las epidemias de fiebre amarilla. Entonces, es una pregunta, ahorita que la tengo aquí, ¿cuál era el recurso energético por excelencia durante el siglo XIX en Nueva Orleans para la producción de la industria azucarera y el impulso de la tanta importancia usted le da como parte nodal de la explosión de las epidemias de fiebre amarilla? Como pregunta. Entonces, pues aunque hay poca gente, pero yo sí quisiera invitar a todos a, cuando el libro esté disponible, ya sea en un formato electrónico o en otra presentación, a leerlo y a aprender, porque es un libro en el cual uno se emociona, porque está realmente entendiendo un proceso que es poco estudiado en México, ¿no? Y cómo eso nos puede ayudar a pensar algunas líneas de investigación en nuestro país. Entonces, pues yo en breve le enviaré el documento que preparé, el cual también, pues uno sabe que aprovechará para mandarlo como reseña mucho más trabajada a alguna revista, sea Environmental History o algo así. Difusión y se conozca en el medio. Muchísimas gracias.
Yo creo que podemos Urmi sobre el combustible y preguntas del público. If you have, si tienen preguntas, you have any
comments so I can understand them better. So the question about energy, can you retranslate it?
Okay. The question that Humberto asked was what was the source of the fuel that they needed to move the machines in the sugar industry, and how it is related with the fuel used by the steamboats and the train transformation, and how it is related with the technological change that you are arguing it was part of the outbreaks in that period. So what was, and Humberto said that there was few carbon coal from vegetable sources used in Cuba in the sugar industry, and what was the source of that energy in the sugar. That was linked with the environment. Well, not disaster. The environmental change in that period, if they were using also the forest to add fuel to the sugar.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you're right that in the other chapters I expand more as I get deeper into the 19th century. But on sugar plantations, initially, cypress wood from the surrounding swamps were used for fuel. The steamships were by coal. Sugar plantations. Well, so I guess the energy on plantations and the more city roads in the Mississippi Valley grew more rail lines in the Mississippi Valley that spread yellow. So I'm not sure if that answers the question.
No, sí.
Esta tu pregunta es que usaron carbón y madera. Pero what was the impact of the environmental impact of using wood, for example, cutting trees, putting the environmental impact? How does it add to your narrative?
So the impact narrative. So yeah, I went through it very quickly in those slides, but deforestation, especially in addition to drainage and deforestation surrounding New Orleans, enabled Aedes aegypti mosquitoes to populate those cleared landscapes that previously Aedes aegypti doesn't live in forests. So the deforestation led to species extinctions that allowed Aedes aegypti mosquitoes to proliferate because they didn't have any natural any predators anymore. Also, the clearing of forests would have created a kind of dual space of malarial mosquitoes.
La pregunta no es tan compleja, es nada más qué tipo de combustible se utilizó para mover, en primer lugar, toda la industria azucarera de Nueva Orleans, ¿no? Una diferencia entre el carbón mineral, coque, que venía asegurado que había mucha producción ya en de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Y el vegetal que tiene como base la madera de los bosques, ¿no? O sea, para nada más, yo sé que no es era como una curiosidad que yo tenía.
Ella dice que fue madera,
Sí.
madera de los bosques. O sea que
o sea, madera.
Yeah, they were using wood from the forests to build the sugar mills.
No hubo carbón mineral.
I should look into it more, to be honest, but in my understanding, wood was used primarily to sugar mills, and there was a lot of wood in the Mississippi Valley, so unlike Cuba, I guess there wasn't as much of a desire to preserve forests, so wood was abundant primary fuel.
Preguntas, Natalia.
I have a question. Mexico Basin Louisiana had similar problems. Mexico City in early 20s, like Louisiana, is a land between earth and sea. My question is how the floods were resolved.
How,
How the floods
oh,
were resolved.
So, yeah, I think it is very interesting to think, I want to think more about comparing the environment of New Orleans to Mexico City, and there are some important differences as well. But so in New Orleans, floods were controlled by, first of all, building levees. So at the bank of the Mississippi is naturally elevated, but they would bolster those levees by more soil and just building kind of a protective barrier. And then also by draining the top near the rivers where the sugar plantations were, by building drainage canals that would increase the swampland in the back of plantations and make that area very malarial wetland environment. And then later, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were more industrial engineering projects to really get rid of all of the water. But, you know, as Humberto mentioned, in New Orleans, flooding is still a problem, and it's not solved at all. And during Hurricane Katrina, that was a horrific disaster that showed that all of the construction is not really reliable in a more severe hurricane or natural disaster situation. So I would say that it's a constant battle in New Orleans to prevent flooding, and there hasn't been a really effective way. Even those levees will breach or break during high water season, and then entire fields can be flooded.
Es bien importante ver cómo opera la matriz energético y material, porque estamos muy acostumbrados a pensar que el proceso de desarrollo con base en la industrialización fue carbón y hierro. Y con esto se demuestra que no, que el proceso de industrialización justamente, aunque ya muy avanzado en el siglo XIX, sigue teniendo como base la madera y la deforestación, ¿no? Para poder mover toda esa fuerza que necesita el primer impulso industrial, ¿no? Entonces, los historiadores siguen pensando que industrialización es igual a vapor, hierro y carbón mineral, y no, es bosques, deforestación y vapor.
Yeah, and I think that what you said about Cuba is important there, because I think you're right that we think about the industrial revolution and industrialization as being based on coal and fossil fuels, but kind of the earliest industrial capitalism you see, and the earliest steam engines were the ones that were fueled by wood in Cuba and Louisiana.
I wanted to ask about if you could tell us more about the particular racial formation in New Orleans, which, because of the Creole presence, and I presume is different from what was present throughout the rest of the South. And so when explanations or understanding of immunity to yellow fever turn to a racial
Yeah, that's a really important question, I guess, when we think about New Orleans, to understand its distinctiveness and the way that race was understood. And in my book, I trace how over the course of the 19th century, ideas about racial categories and racial difference transformed as it went from being a primarily French Creole kind of culture that had some similarities with Latin America or Mexico as well, but kind of a more Caribbean understanding of a very multi-tiered system of race that's very complex. After the Louisiana Purchase, as more Americans began to control the census and American doctors became prominent, they really followed this binary idea of race as black and white, and then kind of everyone in between was mixed or mulatto. But they made their, I would say that in New Orleans there was kind of, even American doctors early on believed in Creole identity. They thought of Creoles as, I guess, what we call now biologically different than the newcomers. But I think there's a very clear parallel that as New Orleans became more Americanized, and especially with the African American population kind of coming in and being categorized as the same racially as the Creoles of color population, white doctors began to kind of see them all as one racial category.
Okay, well, I have one question. and the question is about what were the therapeutics used in New Orleans? I mean, if they are using different therapeutic techniques or explanations of yellow fever to contrast yellow fever, and if there is something like, for example, in Mexico we use food as a explanation of the degeneration of the race. So, and also and food also as a restorative, has some restorative power in some ailments and diseases and epidemics. So, what if there is a connection between some therapeutic techniques, and if there is something like food as a differentiator between races, if there is a Creole cuisine which is more or less therapeutic, or which is more or less protective of the yellow fever, and how it is connected with your narrative?
That's a very interesting question that I haven't really thought much about, because none of the therapies or therapeutics were effective. So I guess that's kind of a more materialist historian. I don't study the details very much, but there are some interesting examples there was one doctor that I mentioned, Samuel Cartwright. He believed that actually sugarcane juice, fresh sugarcane juice, if planters gave it to their enslaved workers, then that would help to fatten them and make them strengthen their immune system so they might not get sick as much. But I don't know if I have a good answer for you, Joel. Something to think about.
But did the therapeutics change with the shift, when before it was the stranger's disease, and then a shift to seeing it as it's about race, as linked to race and community? Did the therapeutics change?
I mean, I would imagine that the therapeutics would have changed, and I guess I haven't studied that aspect of the physicians that I research. I've read a lot about their ideas about symptoms and causes and ideas of immunity and resistance, and they always have a section on therapeutics, and I just kind of gloss over that because they're like applying calomel, just some medicines that were common at the time that were used to treat a variety of fevers. There were some debates about whether quinine was useful for yellow fever or not, and then there were debates about that amongst the medical community. But there was no definite treatment because nothing worked, and they all were aware of that.
Ok. Muchas gracias. Vamos
Muchas
a
gracias.
tener un receso de 5 minutos y regresamos con la presentación de Christopher Willoughby. Muchas
Thank you. Well, thank you for translating.
gracias.
them.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
Did you bring to
I didn't. I should have brought. I have lots of them. It didn't occur to me to bring them.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias por estar aquí y regresar ahora en los 5 minutos de receso que tuvimos, que fueron más. Pero vamos ahora a recibir a Christopher Willoughby. Él obtuvo su doctorado en la Universidad de Tulane en Nueva Orleans en el 2016 y está trabajando en una estancia en el Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, el Schomburg Center para la cultura negra de la New York Public Library en Estados Unidos, en Nueva York. And he's working en 2 proyectos. Primero, él está haciendo el cambio de su tesis de doctorado a un libro que va a ser titulado Masters of Health, Racial Science and Slavery in American Medical School, y que está ya en Universidad de la University of North Carolina Press. También está editando un volumen con Sean Morris Smith basado en un simposio que organizaron en la Universidad de Rice titulado Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery. Este volumen va a ser publicado por la Universidad de Louisiana, Louisiana State University Press. Christopher Willoughby también ha publicado varios artículos sobre esclavitud y medicina en el Journal of History of Medicine and Allied Science and the Journal of Southern History. Damos la bienvenida a Christopher. We welcome you, Christopher, to the CEIICH. So thank you for being here. And so he's going to present right now. Thank
you. Put this, I'll rearrange a bit. So thank you all for coming and tolerating my inability to speak Spanish. It's really a pleasure to be here in Mexico City. Thanks also to Joel for organizing this event, and Emily, I'm looking forward to your comments, and thank you for engaging with my work. And finally, thank you also to the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in the Sciences and Humanities for hosting the event. So I have kind of 2 agendas here. I'm going to first, since this is the last chapter in my book manuscript, I want to set up where that is in a narrative arc. And then second, I'm going to kind of give a little more holistic summary of the chapter itself. So in my book manuscript, I situate the medical professions, exploitation of African descendants' bodies for knowledge production, as starting with the first medical schools in the colonial North. I base my analysis on a reading of over 4,000 medical student dissertations from the University of Pennsylvania, Medical College of the State of South Carolina, the University of Nashville, and Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. And these theses represent the core sources for my project, and I'm utilizing them to think about how students, as future physicians, average physicians, will construct race in their daily practice. And I also utilize a variety of other records, including slave narratives, archaeological reports, textbooks, newspapers, travel diaries, and museum catalogs. So by analyzing white students from diverse class and geographic backgrounds, I access how the typical US physician understood African Americans' bodies and their appropriate treatment. White medical students collectively reimagined African Americans as anatomically distinct, suited for hard labor, and capable of being manipulated in ways unfit for white bodies. Thus, I'm trying to illuminate how racism emerged and was proliferated through middle-class, rural, and small-town doctors, as well as elite racial scientists. So in my larger project, I'm making 3 interventions that hopefully will reshape how we think about early racial science and the history of medicine, as well as national politics in the period leading up to the abolition of slavery. So first, I take the story of the history of slavery and medicine out of the plantation, and I'm putting it into institutions that have endured through much of the history of US medicine. Over the last decade in the US, historians and universities have begun to systematically analyze the history of slavery in higher education and how higher education was built on the money of enslaved people's labor. Although I think they've been a little bit slow to think about imperialism and transnational corporate exploitation. So my book, but there has been no similar study of slavery in medical schools. My book will fill this gap, which in my opinion is an important task, as medicine has been so central to disseminating concepts of race for the last 2 centuries. Second, by focusing on institutions in societies with slavery and societies without slavery, I'm showing how the medical exploitation of African descendants had utility across the nation and not just in societies with slavery. And the medical construction of white supremacy had a broader political purpose beyond just an immediate debate over slavery. More broadly, the ubiquity of biodeterminist race science in Northeastern medical schools serves as a reminder that one could oppose enslavement and still be deeply racist. In a more limited fashion, I'm also examining this within a transatlantic context, considering the influence of European medicine and imperialism, along with a limited engagement with racial ideas coming from the Caribbean and Latin America. In short, while this project focuses on US institutions, it shows how US medical identity was shaped through the mobility of bodies and ideas in and around the Atlantic Ocean. And many parts of my book follow US citizens and doctors as they left the US for other spaces, including France, Southern Africa, the British Caribbean, and Brazil, among others. Likewise, while largely the story of the cultivation of a white medical construction of blackness, at times I'm also trying to highlight ways in which African descendants navigated a world meant to objectify, subjugate, and redefine the meaning of their bodies. Along these lines, throughout the books, I have moments where I narrate stories about African descendants that connect to medical school. So in one case, I show how Black New Yorkers confronted medical students who were stealing their cadavers. In other places, I talk about the history of the people whose skulls were collected and used to create racial difference, and kind of putting their stories back into these collections. So this reframing of antebellum racial medicine, I hope, draws attention to the ways in which early racial science discourses set the groundwork for social Darwinism, eugenics, and physical anthropology, and their inclusion in medical education in the 20th and 21st centuries. And thus I conclude by telling this story from the end of the US Civil War to the present. And so for what this does is it kind of, I'm trying to undercut ideas that inheritance and genetics, or race-based understandings of health are legitimate and biologically based, even though, of course, general inheritance and genetics do have health influences. So now I'm going to quickly, or not too quickly, but walk you through the actual chapters, and hopefully a little bit less dry, but I'm not promising anything. In the introduction, I'm telling the history of race in medical education from the colonial and revolutionary eras in the US, and I establish how many of the central features of the problematic relationship between racial science, slavery, and medicine from the late colonial era to the US Civil War were already entrenched since the beginning of medical schools. I begin with the founding of the first medical school in the US, which was the University of Pennsylvania in 1765. And from the beginning, schools excluded African Americans from attending, even as they stole Black cadavers to teach anatomy and construct theories of Black inferiority. In this chapter, I also track the growth of medical departments in the US. So in all of the 18th century, barely more than 200 students graduated from medical schools, but in the last 2 decades of my study, 1840 to 1860 roughly, almost 30,000 Americans graduated from US medical schools. As well as painting this broad picture, I also talk about an early series of experiments upon Henry Moss, a formerly enslaved man suffering from vitiligo. I'm terrible at pronouncing it, but the disease that causes your skin to lose pigmentation. And these medical professors hoped to cure blackness, and so they were trying to figure out why he was losing pigmentation in an effort to kind of literally create a white supremacist U.S. by curing racial difference or ending racial difference medically. Building upon this narrative, the chapter constructs the main themes, which is the construction of a white male identity in the medical school, the development of a medical pedagogy informed by racial science, analysis and exploitation of African Americans by medical students. So in chapter 2, I detail the history of racial science from the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century. I map out the evolution of two theories, monogenesis and polygenesis. Polygenists believed that God created each human race as separate species, and monogenists believed all humans were the same species descending from Adam and Eve, but both could be quite racist, just in different ways. This chapter, wait, let's go, how to, this thing has a mind of its own. I'm not hitting the button. Okay, there we go. In chapter 2, this chapter argues that by the 1850s, so that's an example of a medical dissertation that was very racist. A large portion of the medical profession, including many students by the 1850s, accepted a polygenetic view of African Americans as a permanently distinct species that required unique medical therapeutics. I also tell the story of the black abolitionist Martin Delany, who attended Harvard for 1 year from 1850, and how he sat through a deeply racial science-influenced pedagogy, and then wrote about racial science in his later, and obviously had a different take on it than his white professors. And moreover, this chapter just establishes this broader connection by discussing how racial science, these two theories, were very overtly discussed in the medical school, not even from a kind of practical medical perspective. And students like McDowell could, for their final dissertation, write an ethnology or a racial science text. The next chapter and the next two chapters really, or next three chapters, zero in on the kind of history of anatomy in medical schools, and with how dissections represented a key site for teaching polygenesis. In these spaces, students learned that racial difference existed inside the human body, and by examining how students manipulated, handled, and ordered human remains in the medical museum, I tease out how a racial education was formulated through tactile learning in social spaces, as well as through note-taking and recitation. So from the convenience of the museum, students engaged with human body parts from around the globe. Specifically, they encountered the remains of racialized bodies through the organizational system of the anatomical museum. The curator literally reproduced white supremacy in the museum's shelves, with whites in a superior position to all other races. And they also had a lot of indigenous body parts that were stolen from different places. So they had a mummified child's head from at Harvard, was obviously stolen. And Harvard has some of these collections still. So with these collections, students kind of learn to physically control non-white bodies and possess their remains, and established a medical mastery that kind of paired up with the broader white supremacist mastery within American culture. And what I call the kind of pairing of this anatomical and white supremacist, general white supremacist gaze, I call the clinical racial gaze. So in this is really going without my touching the button, but it's fine. It's haunted. We're fine right now. So in chapter 4, I just need to speed up. In chapter 4, I consider the practical application of these racial theories within the medical school. First, this chapter argues that medical schools in the northern colonies and later states such as Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania established a general model for obtaining dissection materials, stealing black corpses with abandon, and poor whites when necessary. Make sure we're on the right. Yep. So this is a picture of students in a dissection, and so cadavers really got, carved up to a point of unrecognizability. And so, like studies of plantation hospitals, which are more prominent in historiography, I'm assessing the complicit nature of northern poorhouses and public hospitals in the widespread practice of body snatching of people of color. It's also worth noting that African descendants confronted doctors when they could. And then finally, this chapter analyzes how students discussed and experimented upon enslaved patients in their dissertations. And I found a couple of really too terrible to go into without giving it justice, but very awful use of living people's bodies for just your senior thesis. So they did physiological trials that were only meant to kind of assess theoretical questions, not practice-based therapeutics. And the students acted out what I call the medical chattel principle, which is, once again, this confluence between kind of medical appropriation of non-white people's bodies and the chattel principle, which on the slave plantation was this idea of enslaved people's bodies were literal chattel, like cows or other livestock. So this kind of combining of how the medical profession exploited people with how learning from the plantation. Let me see what. So, and then the next two chapters really shift in focus, and the last one is what I'm workshopping today, but examining how professors and students used medical and racial theory to understand race in Atlantic and to a lesser extent global perspective. So the first 3 or 4 chapters are really focused on a domestic narrative and what's happening to race and medicine in the discourses over abolition of slavery. And then these last 2 chapters begin to think about how that discourse will survive into the kind of age of imperialism and global imperialism. Obviously, there's a previous age of imperialism. So chapter 5 examines the evolution and development of the clinical racial gaze in the United States and Atlantic world, borrowing heavily from the methodologies of French clinical medicine, such as dissection and statistical analysis. Physician racial scientists define race through perceived anatomical differences. Specifically, I emphasize how U.S. physician racial scientists' work on racial anatomy was mutually informed by their French medical education and experience in handling and observing African descendants in societies with slavery. It's also worth noting there was a great deal of correlation between being a racial scientist and a medical professor, and an anatomy professor in particular. So Jeffries Wyman at Harvard and previously at Hampton-Sydney College was a racial scientist. Josiah Knott, who Urmi mentioned in her paper, was the professor of anatomy at the University of New Orleans, briefly, Tulane, and was one of the founders of the Medical College of Alabama. Samuel George Morton with Pennsylvania Medical College. I could go on like listing names, but and it kind of shocked me when I realized that nobody kind of correlated how many racial scientists were in deeply influential positions at medical schools, and that's why the lack of that correlation, in my opinion, by historians is why this story hasn't been told, because it's very glaring once you kind of put that together. So this chapter, the second briefly also narrates the history of 2 skulls in Harvard's collection, and it prefigures my next book project, which is a history of that skull collection. And in telling these 2 stories, I'm trying to figuratively put flesh back on the skulls of people. So this is Harvard's Anatomical Museum, and if you look around there, you can also see heads all around under the railings, a phrenological collection. And so I'm trying to put flesh back on these heads and tell the stories of the people, how they died, how their bodies ended up in medical schools and what their lives were like, and kind of intimately reminding people that skull collections are collections of dead people's bodies who were stolen from their homelands, and hopefully some longer-term project thinking about working on repatriating them. So one of these stories is of Stormon, a Khoisan man from southern Africa who was displayed in Boston as a living exhibit before committing suicide in 1861. And I also tell the story of a named leader from the 1835 Muslim uprising in Salvador de Bahia, Brazil, whose souls ended up at Harvard. And in telling their stories, I'm pushing back against the erasure of these individuals' lives that is inherent to both museum skull collections and racial scientific methods. I also argue that to other scholars that when we research these objects, it is incumbent upon us to not just narrate racial theories elucidated by white supremacists, but also to tell stories about those who are racialized. In many ways, sections such as this also represent kind of larger shift I'm taking at the Schomburg Center to think more about the people of color and subordinated people and how they fit into this history of slavery, race, and medicine. So, magically is already on to chapter 6 that people in the audience got to read. I'm kind of telling the second half of this imperial narrative and how this more theoretical discourse built around anatomy and reconstructing the conformation of people's bodies was enacted through concepts of therapeutics and restated by medical students. So first, I start with narrating how in the early national period and late colonial period, doctors thought of race as deeply fluid, and its relationship to the physical environment and social environments is very fluid. So in that story in the first chapter that I mentioned of the doctors testing the man who was turning white to figure out how to cure race, that's their belief that race is deeply transient, connected to social and environmental forces that if manipulated, they could then turn all people of African descent white. But as polygenesis, that idea of people of African descent, but it was really 5 different species, but I'm mostly focusing on African descendants. But the other species would have been Native Americans, Asia. Well, it's somewhat complicated because they have a lot of different numbering systems, but say Asians broadly, whites, and then Pacific Islanders. They wouldn't have used those terms. But so they split it up into 5 species. But on a day-to-day basis in the US, it was more about enslaved African descendants' bodies. And so once polygenesis takes hold in the scientific community and gets started to get taught in medical schools, you see a shift in the broader theoretical approach to medical practice and therapeutics. So they start arguing that people of African descent, and so in the case of Urmi's work in this idea of racial immunity to yellow fever is a part of this kind of discursive shift towards seeing race as inherently tied to certain environments. So people of African descent were created by God as a separate species and placed in Africa by God and built for diseases like yellow fever that they believed were coming out of Africa, and malaria, and gifted with kind of inherited immunities that were incontrovertible. So that's this kind of broader shift in the history of racial science that's happening. And students, one of the things that really caught my eye is that students really latched onto this shift. So I think it was 17 out of 18 medical students who discussed yellow fever and racial immunity all agreed, 17 out of 18 agreed that people of African descent had an inherited immunity to yellow fever, and they had a similar data point on malaria as well. Second, students argued, and maybe kind of speaking a little bit to the therapeutics question earlier, students argued broadly that people of African descent did not respond to heroic therapeutics. So the therapeutics of the period were, you bleed somebody, you force them to vomit or have evacuate their bowels, and that was very much the common therapeutics, but doctors argued that people of African descent did not respond well to this, so that you actually shouldn't do these heroic treatments, and so-called heroic because they were so terrible, and that you had to be heroic to survive them. So it was a rare case where maybe racism benefited enslaved people, that they weren't being bled and forced to vomit and defecate to cure their yellow fever. But students unanimously agreed that you had to bleed people of African descent less. And students also learned in medical school how to become a part of kind of the terror and surveillance networks of the plantation and of white supremacy. So there was a theory and fear that people of African descent were always lying about their diseases to get out of work. So students had to learn how to kind of psychologically terrorize enslaved people, or students who would go into practice in plantation districts, how to psychologically terrorize enslaved people in order to force them to not fake their illnesses. In one case, a student talked about a doctor who dug a grave in the middle of the plantation and said the next enslaved person, used much less friendly language, enslaved person who complained of a fever would be buried alive. And the student wrote about this in their medical notebook from their course. So students in the medical school are learning this kind of way of seeing black bodies as inherently tied to tropical environments, requiring distinct therapeutics, and having certain distinct connections to diseases. And then they also are learning how to kind of the methodologies of the slaveholder to treat enslaved people. And then I'm also arguing in this chapter about this shift from this nationalistic story of slavery to a global imperial lens. In the beginning of doctors thinking about the health of non-white bodies on a global scale and in comparative context. So the racial scientists who are influencing these students and the students who actually write about them also compare enslaved bodies to imperial data that's being collected in parts of West Africa, North Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and India and East Asia. So they're creating global data sets to understand racial health and not just talking about health on the southern plantation. And what I argue is that this is going to, so this is in the 1850s, the US will abolish slavery pragmatically in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. But there's been a debate over slavery, and it would appear very possible that slavery could be abolished by the 1850s. And so doctors are beginning to conceptualize what will white supremacy look like without slavery, and what is, as the kind of European countries, England, Spain, England and France in particular at this period, but earlier Spain, are carving up the world for their empires. What does the US want to be an empire? Where would they control? They obviously have failed invasions of Central America during this period and Cuba, and then create a colony in Liberia, but compared to the major European powers, the American empire is very small. So doctors are thinking comparatively to begin the ability to translate this racial medicine to an imperial context. And we'll see this in really manifest at the turn of the 20th century with tropical medicine. But I'm showing in this chapter that discourse is emerging much earlier than we tend to think of. And then I finally end with the story of Jeffries Wyman, Harvard professor, who travels to Dutch Suriname in 1857. He's actually collecting natural history specimens for what will become the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. I think I'm getting the full name right, but at Harvard University. So he's basically going to collect snakes and other animals to put on display at Harvard from Suriname. But while he's there, Wyman, who was trained at Harvard, wrote in other contexts about racial science. He makes a lot of observations about enslaved people along health and racial lines, and he ends his trip in a maroon or escaped slave community called the Samaka. And he sees the Samaka as this kind of window into a pure Africa, even though it has very little to do with it, as they escaped slavery in Suriname 150 years prior and have created a kind of distinct Atlantic Creole culture. But Wyman uses his trip to the Samaka to see black bodies in action and see kind of African barbarity, those are his words, in action, and comes out with, roughly the same thing he believed beforehand, but uses this travel to further kind of his perception of race and the way he describes racial difference. And so it's not just a US-based context, but these US physicians are constructing racial difference locally, globally. And I also know that the Samaka were kind of playing Wyman throughout his trip and preventing him from actually seeing a lot of the stuff that he wanted, and had their own kind of response to this white invader of their space, even though they, based on their treaty with the Dutch government, had to admit him. And so that's really what I'm talking about today, and what the things that, as a scholar, that are interesting me right now are these transitions from nationalistic white supremacy in the U.S. That emerge around discourses of slavery, and how these early nationalistic discourses will seed the ground for a later imperial discourse and global capitalist discourse of white supremacy. So I'd love to end there and speak more about that. I'm looking forward to Emily's comments. So thank you all for listening to me. See if I have a, yes, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chris. And we are going to welcome, vamos a darle la bienvenida a Emily Vazquez, que va a ser, está haciendo una estancia de investigación en la Ciudad de México, es de la Universidad de Columbia, y va a dar un comentario sobre el trabajo de Chris que leyó, entonces a ver qué nos dice sobre el tema. Muchas gracias.
Okay, is that good? Okay. So I am a sociologist of science and medicine. I am not a historian. And so I have read Christopher's chapter as a sociologist, and I'm going to talk about it in the way that I would talk about it as if I was teaching a course in sociology, on sociology of science and medicine. I hope that's okay, and others will help me fill in the gaps in terms of comments that we might make historically. So thank you, Joel and Christopher, for giving me the opportunity to read the chapter. The chapter, as Christopher explained, is an excerpt from his upcoming book. And I wanted to talk for a minute about the fact that Christopher's book couldn't be more timely. Across social spheres, including in science and medicine in the United States, as I'm sure you all know, we've arrived at a time of crisis, not at a time of crisis, but rather at a time of new recognition and reckoning with the fundamental crisis that has always beset our nation, our democracy, that of race in the United States. As cell phone videos increasingly captured police brutality against and police murder of Black men, and social media facilitated collective action, Black Lives Matter rallies have commanded our national attention over the last 5 years. Then 16 months ago, we were shocked by scenes from Charlottesville, Virginia, when torch-bearing white supremacists swarmed the streets of the college town, many wearing or bearing the Confederate flag and Nazi swastikas. Chanting "White Lives Matter" and "Jews will not replace us," they demanded the protection of Confederate monuments across the South, monuments to leaders of the Civil War, to those who fought on behalf of the South and for the preservation of slavery. In Charlottesville, a 20-year-old man who had traveled there to participate in the march used his speeding car as a weapon, driving into a crowd of counter-protesters who had come out in protest of the march. In doing so, he killed a 32-year-old young woman and injured 40 others. 3 days ago, last Friday, he was found guilty of her murder. We, and much of the world, were shocked by the violence, and we were shocked again when Donald Trump declared to the nation that in Charlottesville, quote, "You had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent." Rather than denouncing neo-Nazi and white supremacist vitriol at Charlottesville, Trump assigned blame to, quote, "many sides" for the fatal violence. News footage from Charlottesville and Donald Trump's reaction constitute the final scenes of Spike Lee's most recent film, Black Klansman. Also, just last week, it was nominated for a Golden Globe. It's really good. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. The movie tells the true story of the first Black police officer in Colorado Springs, Colorado, who early on the job in the early 1970s, managed to infiltrate the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan that was plotting to assassinate a local Black activist. The movie ends with scenes from the 2017 march in Charlottesville to remind us that these events from the 1970s are a history that is ongoing. Race in the United States is our past, our present, and evidently our future. Science and medicine have always been participants in this formation, and there is currently no end in sight for their role. Indeed, as Christopher shows in this chapter, race and racism were constitutive of modern medicine's foundation in the country and of the field's understanding of bodies, disease, and health. As Christopher has noted in his summary of his forthcoming book, the book will show that the story of racial medicine in the United States is not one of aberrant or anomalous episodes like the Tuskegee experiments. Instead, the book will show racism was built into the very core of the U.S.'s first major medical institutions, medical schools. As Christopher writes, reckoning with this continuity forces us to see that medicine's race problem won't be cured through trying to improve race science, but only through medicine abandoning the notion that race has ingrained biomedical features, end quote. And one more comment regarding the timeliness of the book before I move to the content of the chapter. I want to note that amidst this moment of national reckoning, some medical students are finding ways to take action. In April of this year, a medical student-run group called White Coats for Black Lives, which has chapters in 21 states, published a 129-page report grading top medical schools on their work to combat racism within their institutions, in the research they produce, and more broadly in the distribution of health and care in the United States. Among the many concerns the report raised, it highlighted, for example, the inherent bias of free clinics at medical schools and consequently the care of already vulnerable populations by undertrained first and second year students. Yet it is still most often social scientists who denounce the continued use of race as an entity with biological significance in medicine in the United States. Moreover, medical schools are scrambling in this current moment to figure out how to integrate anti-racism training into medical school curriculums. Last year, an article was published in the Journal of Academic Medicine that admitted, quote, "Our students are now demanding open dialogue about race, and we educators are denying them." This, the authors explained, is because faculty don't actually know how to teach about race and racism or their relevance to medicine. As the article argues, faculty themselves require training. For a wonderful article on why it's so hard to teach about race in medicine, especially in the age of genomic medicine, even for social scientists who specialize in race studies, take a look at Warwick Anderson's 2008 paper entitled Teaching Race at Medical School. Christopher's book, I believe, will be a useful resource with the potential to contribute to this institutional reckoning at hand. Importantly, his work shows that the task at hand now is not just to learn how to teach about race in medical school. The task at hand involves undoing long-standing practices of knowledge production carried out through the lens of race and the work of finding other ways of knowing. Christopher's chapter and his talk today show how medical schools in the antebellum era, especially in the U.S. South, taught about the relationship between race, health, and the environment. He focuses on an era when this relationship and therefore understandings of race underwent significant revision. As Christopher noted, during the late colonial and early national periods, a number of prominent U.S. physicians ascribed to the theory of monogenesis and so understood race as the consequence of environment and disease as an imbalance created when bodies suffered or were degenerated, for example, by exposure to tropical extremes. Following this line of thought, physicians largely treated people of each race the same therapeutically, and they believed that people, regardless of race, reacted to specific environments in ways that were largely universal. This perspective actually led monogenicists, as Christopher points out, to study the material conditions of slavery as causes of disease and to reject the idea of differential immunity between the races. But in the antebellum era, as Christopher shows us, an alternative perspective, polygenesis gained strength among U.S. physicians and at medical schools. Polygenesis thought posited the races of man as originally separate types, and as separate types, they each had a different relationship with and reactions to the environment. Therapeutic specificity was thus required to treat the races because medical practices useful in one type of person or climate were not always effective in others. Ultimately, Christopher writes, quote, "Physicians' distinct approaches to Black health aided in the naturalization of Black people as a permanent biological underclass in the Atlantic world, meant specifically for only select occupations and geographies that could not be subverted." Christopher's focus on a moment of change and revision in understandings of race in medicine foregrounds analytically that race is only ever recognizable or knowable in practice. Indeed, rather than race, we can instead come to understand more accurately racial projects as the classic racist theorists Ami and Winant have proposed. Race itself is unstable and constantly in the making through practice. And in this sense, medical school faculty today concerned with teaching about race might be well served to focus less on defining race, an immense challenge, and more so on identifying racializing and racist practices. Moreover, as Ami and Winant noted in their now classic text, every racial project is both a reflection of and response to the broader patterning of race in the overall social system. In other words, ways of doing race, of practicing race, are not arbitrary. As we see in Christopher's chapter, racial projects within medicine are co-produced with and by broader racial projects within and beyond the United States. As Montoya has written, drawing on Latour and Fujimura, quote, "A scientific claim is always co-produced with the problems that instantiated its examination in the first place." Thus, the uptake of polygenesis must be understood, as Christopher shows us, within the context of escalating political tensions in the antebellum period between the North and the South over the future of American slavery, as well as escalating interest in the nation's imperialist future. With regard to the theory of polygenesis, I want to turn for a moment to the related concept of therapeutic specificity that Christopher discusses. Linked to polygenesis's endorsement of distinct original human types, the doctrine of specificity, Christopher writes, argued that not all treatment and therapy plans worked equally well for each patient. Instead, physicians had to account for a patient's age, sex, color, climate, and occupation when making treatment decisions. Instead of existing in fluid and evolving relationships to the environment, under polygenesis, physicians understood the human body as having fixed intercourse with its surroundings, and they made it their duty to comprehend these supposedly static relationships between bodies and places that dated back for millennia. A leading theorist at the time, Samuel Henry Dixon, wrote in 1855 that, quote, "Original predisposition may be, 1, idiosyncratic or personally constitutional, 2, parental or hereditarily constitutional, or 3, tribal or derived from characteristics of race." Reading this, I was astounded by the similarity between mid-19th century ideas of specificity in medicine to current pursuits to personalize medicine or achieve precision medicine. As Christopher points out in his chapter, therapeutic specificity, ironically, still had the tendency to universalize peoples and climates just along racial lines. And this indeed remains the reality today as physicians and scientists seek to develop personalized medicine to tailor both prevention and treatment to account for an individual's genetic makeup, behavior, and environmental circumstances. In our present day, the search for genetic mutations relevant to health and disease, populations most often defined by race, ethnicity, or nation remain the obligatory passage points through which precision or personalized knowledge has been produced. Moreover, it is through the quest for personalized medicine, particularly the application of genomic science to medicine, that the relationship between race and science has been most visibly reanimated over the last 2 decades. It was fascinating to see the deep historical roots of this contemporary quest and problematic laid bare in Christopher's talk. Another illuminating dimension of Christopher's chapter was the insight it provided into how 19th century physicians viewed their professional responsibility. Referring to Jeffries Wyman, the Boston-based physician who traveled to slaveholding Virginia and also to Suriname, Christopher writes that Wyman's travels underscored how he understood defining race and social relations as an adjunct duty of the medical profession. Wyman supposed that physician scientists had a central role to play in the political future of African descendants and the relation to larger institutions that connected people from around the globe, such as slavery and empire. Christopher also highlights how, like prominent racial theorists at the time, antebellum era medical students conceptualized the medical profession's aid as essential to the success of Atlantic capitalism. As I read these passages in Christopher's text, I was reminded of the contemporary genomic scientists that Catherine Bliss interviewed, who consider their research into the genetic drivers of racial health disparities in the US a social justice imperative. not just a scientific, but a political duty intended to redress racial wrongs in the United States. These passages in Christopher's chapter also brought to mind medical rhetoric here in Mexico, in which research, prevention, and improvements in treatment for diabetes are framed as contributions to the country's economic well-being. How might things be different if the responsibilities of medicine were perceived differently then and now? Finally, I want to turn to the very interesting connections that Christopher draws in the chapter between medical knowledge-making about and comparisons made between the U.S. South and other slaveholding regions. While the influence of French anatomists, and other European perspectives have been widely documented on 19th century medicine in the U.S., Christopher brings forth the transnational travels of physicians and movement of medical knowledge, especially data, between the U.S. South and other subtropical and tropical regions also marked by the presence of the slave trade. Christopher writes, peering beyond just internal questions of slavery and its survival, students also interrogated whether empire was sound health policy for the United States. Building upon this broader discursive shift, medical students and professors began to depict the relationship between race, health, and the environment on a global scale, and they believed that their research could shape the future of slavery as well as the United States' potential evolution into an imperial power. Christopher thus offers important new perspective into how, in the antebellum period, the U.S. South was already becoming scientifically connected to regions further south, including in Latin America. This powerfully presages the intensification of a southward gaze that took place toward the turn of the century, as the Monroe Doctrine took hold as the basic diplomatic principle guiding relations with Latin American countries, and U.S. scientists increasingly looked south for an expansion of their intellectual territory. As our own Edna Suarez Diaz, who I wish was with us today, has written, regions including Latin America's land and peoples would become part of a larger living laboratory, where the evolving nature of U.S. diplomacy was tested in combination with the implementation of early development projects in public health, agriculture, and nutrition science. As Christopher's work suggests, the perceived relationship between racialized bodies and the land, as well as the link perceived between slaveholding territories in a deeply integrated emerging global capitalist economy, spurred a transnational movement of knowledge and data that appears to have been early scaffolding for this later scientific and diplomatic expansion. It is here that I want to pick up with a few questions for Christopher in order to open our collective discussion. I wanted to ask first about the expansive review that you conducted, reading over 4,000 medical theses written during the antebellum period, and to give you a chance to talk more about them more broadly. The chapter does a wonderful job of tracing how race is mobilized in the theses that focus on it, but I wanted to ask to what extent race is a central concern across the theses. How fundamental was race to general understanding of health and disease at the time? I'm also curious whether any students recognized or dealt with the issue of racial mixing. In the chapter, you also highlight the unabashed medical gaze directed specifically toward the Black female body. And I wondered if you might want to elaborate here on the significance and consequences of that reality. And finally, I wanted to ask if you would highlight any moments in the history of U.S. medical schools where the legacies of polygenesis are ever seriously brought into question and rejected. Is there a historical moment for you that stands out as a reckoning in U.S. medical schools where the biological legacy of race and race science is deeply and broadly questioned? I try to end on a point of hope.
Maybe my answer
will help or not? Not. I worried that it wouldn't.
First of all, my preemptive thank yous for your comments were justified. You summarized my paper better than I did, so I very much appreciate it. And I will ask you to please send me your comments. There are some things, some nuggets I wish I was trying to scribble. So to get to your questions, maybe I'll start with the go in order. So the medical student theses are, first of all, a little more holistically about the genre. They're about 20 pages long, handwritten, with terrible spelling, and heavily plagiarized. So what medical student theses in this period provide is more of a reflection. It's like a terrible undergrad paper. They're more of a reflection of pedagogy and the types of texts that they're reading, rather than maybe how we think of a dissertation today as a creative act. There was one professor who suggested on the 4th of July, on Independence Day, rather than fireworks, burning all of the medical theses that the university had collected as a valuable use of them. But that's what, to me, makes them so interesting, is they're not these great moments of theorizing by major intellectuals, but rather reflect how your average idiot doctor engaged with the most important thinkers of their time. And some of them, there are some standout theses, but as an average baseline, that's really what they represent. And so what my project and what I found was I didn't expect race to be central. Race was mentioned in about 10% of all the theses, which I think is a notable quantity. So I have like a little library of about 400 racist student theses out of 4,000. And what to me is really interesting about them is, while there are these very exceptional texts where maybe 10 to 20, where they're writing about racial science as their final project, what's in some ways more interesting is how you can really see race as a part of the fabric of medicine and being very unquestionably brought in. So on a dissertation about yellow fever, you have to talk, not everyone, but a very strong proportion of students talked about race for a page or two. It's like this, that's a part of that disease etiology, and an accepted part of it. As to pass your exam, you have to cover that. Same with texts on bleeding or venesection. So what you can really see is how race had very much permeated medical thinking in a very casual way, rather than as an overt political project. But you do get these horrifying and amazing moments where immediately leads into this chapter, the conclusion. I talk about one student's dissertation where he goes on and on very laudatorily about the spread of whites around the world and the extermination of people of color in Africa, South America, Latin America, and Asia. And he's just, this is the future of the world, and it's great to be a white person, and that we're going to have a white world eventually. So you do have moments where it transitions into a brief discussion of yellow fever, and students will run away with themselves and their racism and go on a kind of rant. And so more often than not, though, I would say what's interesting about the theses is thinking about how race is really a generic portion of medical thinking rather than an exceptional one. And it's deployed in much the same way as age or other facets, other kind of specificity-based components. So race mixing, there are some students who talk about that. And it's one of the historian of this discourse, I would say it's one of the great kind of conundrums of it, is that polygenists, who many of them live in places like New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina, which have long histories of interracial mixing, and you can see people of all different shades being defined as black because of the one drop rule. If you have one drop of black blood, you're black in the U.S. system, racial hierarchy. So initially, and the basic premise that if you can interbreed, you are the same species. So amazingly enough, people like Josiah Nott, who lived in Mobile and New Orleans, initially rejects this and says that all mixed race people are infertile hybrids. But then by about the 1850s, they do a pretty clever sleight of hand, I would say, the race scientists, and the students pick up on this. They're very in tune to this race science. And they start arguing, well, maybe race mixing isn't the definition of species, and maybe it's anatomy. So Joseph Lyons is the professor of anatomy at Penn, and really more known as an archaeologist. He doesn't write a lot about race except for in his lectures to students. But he argues that race is more defined by permanent, identifiable anatomical features. And so what they really do once it becomes patently absurd to argue that white and black people cannot successfully interbreed, they just go, it doesn't matter, anatomy, and students generally follow that. And then the long-term effects on the black female body, that's something I'm afraid to conjecture about because I don't feel competent enough in some ways. Like I wish my mentor were here to pick up on that answer. The wonderful Deirdre Cooper Owens, who I would highly recommend her work. But I would say obviously this kind of casual violence against women of color and the casual sexualization, a part of this medical process, I think unsurprisingly, or certainly has an influence and has a developmental track that a better historian of gender than myself could follow. But I know from even anecdotal accounts of women of color and working with gynecologists today, still have weird experiences, we'll put it that way, that seem to echo some of this presumptuousness of white doctors towards women of color's bodies. And then the moment of reckoning, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to come off as too pessimistic. So I think there's not really a moment of reckoning with polygenesis, in my opinion. So what I argue in the epilogue is that the kind of transition to a Darwinian causal narrative of racial difference is very smooth, and that doctors don't really care that much about the causal narrative. So like Josiah Nott, who's one of the main theorists I discuss, it takes him a couple years, like 7 or 8 years, to become a Darwinian. Joseph Leidy at Penn is a Darwinian from day one, but his lectures don't change. And so what they're really interested in is this anatomical discourse. And so the fact that maybe in their new framing, evolution created racial difference, Josiah Nott's a kind of aggressive atheist, closeted aggressive atheist, who doesn't really care if God created different races. So he doesn't mind. And maybe, the closest thing I think we have had historically is maybe the Tuskegee experiments, but I'm somewhat, and I think there was a moment of reckoning and the Nazi eugenics periods, but I think the problem is doctors have constantly tried to explain why the previous generation of doctors are racist rather than delve into their own core questions. But I will say, this doesn't mean the lack of a historical moment of reckoning. I'm actually a little bit more optimistic, as I think there, people of color represent much higher rates in the medical profession than previously. And I haven't seen that study, but other studies that are really in medical literature, there was one about UVA, University of Virginia's medical school, that showed that, this maybe, to me, the fact that these studies are coming out is a sign of optimism, but their findings are not very optimistic. But that a majority of medical students at UVA believe that black people experience less pain, and which goes back to the early 19th century, and I think they also thought they had thicker skin as well at UVA. But I think things like seeing doctors stand up and get the J. Marion Sims statue taken down in Central Park, and I think if there's a moment to be optimistic about, it's actually now and not a past moment. I'm not overly optimistic, but I see more kind of activism around this issue that comes from a really different perspective rather than, I think so much of it was doctors trying to, especially white doctors, argue why they're not like other people, like the bad racists. And I think now there are more people of color within the medical profession who have a stronger voice within the medical profession, who are maybe forcing these as core questions rather than people being defensive about their current medicine. So I'm a little more optimistic. I think the moment of reckoning, if it's going to happen, we're starting to have it now rather than in the past, which hopefully, fingers crossed. Thank you again for your comments.
Preguntas para Christopher? Do you have questions? Bueno, ¿tienen preguntas? No.
Joel, an anthropologist going back to history. But I am very interested in, well, in the period and in the subjects you treated, because I am trying to explore. I try to explore how does anthropology took distance from biology and medicine. So somehow that's useful for me, all the story you made. But exactly one thing I was wondering while hearing you is, how does the processes you are developing goes in parallel or cross history of biology or anthropology? That's, I don't know, for what I've read, for example, in Europe, all this in France, all this measure of or uses of skulls and bones was made pretty much in med school, of course, but not only in the Natural History Museum or in this proto-anthropology very close to biology and evolution. So I don't know if there's something to dig there or not at all. And in relation to what you were discussing about race mixing, one topic I am very interested in, but for the 20th century, is this idea of passing, you know, which is very important in I mean, this, for me, it was very, how could you say, very significant of how race is understood in the US, right? Because it's so difficult to think about passing in Mexico. So there you have like this cue to enter and to reveal some kind of a system, right? And as far as I understand, this idea of passing becomes very important after emancipation, after Civil War, because before blackness was associated to slavery, right? So once slavery becomes illegal, somehow those people can be seen, can move through society, and if they have this white phenotype, more and more, right? So I don't know if something was thought of in your thesis, in the thesis you were studying, and in all this discussion about race in medicine, about passing. What do we do with these people that has passed or that can pass, right? And the last thing I was thinking there is when you were talking about plantations and how, I mean, one very like classic question we do in anthropology is how this defining the other is useful to define the us, right? So how, if I don't know if in any part of your book, or even if it's, maybe it's so obvious that we don't need to think about it, but how was the admission, for example, for med school? I mean, I assume that no black people could go to med school, but mixed, I mean, there was, how could you say, like ancestry studies for the students that came in. I mean, you had to prove not having any, or this was so obvious that nobody needs to ask for that kind of question. And in the same vein of question, in Mexico, I know this work of Laura Cházaro that studies medicines in more or less the same periods as you. One of her statements, very much, one of their main statement is how the emergence of a national science, the study of race in medicine came very soon with the idea of a national medicine, right? And for that national medicine, we need to have instruments, national instruments somehow, that French instruments couldn't measure Mexican bodies, right? Or local bodies. So I don't know in what extent does all this question about the racialized body was useful, or in which ways was useful to the production of a national science or a national us. I don't know. Thank you very much. That was very inspiring.
Thank you. In spite of your soft paddling, the really great questions that are very germane to my research. So I definitely can speak to every one. Like, yeah, they're very much a part of the core of this context. So how does this history, so to get your first question, like thinking about this more broadly, in some ways, what I'm doing in my research is pushing away from the broader and moving into a more specific context. Much of the historiography in the US is really about this race science as a popular discourse and to a lesser extent as a natural history discourse or proto-anthropology. So a lot of people have focused on very much on the application of it to a pro-slavery argument. And then also they treat Samuel Morton, who was a skull collector in Philadelphia, as like one of the few pure scientists, even though he was deeply problematic and wrong. Well, I'll slow down. Even though they argue that his science was incorrect, they see him, because he was a Northerner, as somewhat more divorced from the pro-slavery politics. But what I think is interesting, and what I think is interesting by looking at the medical school, to speak to that larger history of a more broad national and international scientific discourse, is how you have people becoming trained in those discourses, and who will then, and I have no evidence of this, but I have minimal evidence of this, but who most of them will go practice in a very rural part of the country and bring those popular discourses to audiences that wouldn't read scientific texts, but through casual racist conversations. And I have seen in the study of one kind of smaller racial scientist corresponding with his dad in Alabama, and his dad's like very religious. Of course, he's in Alabama, a very conservative part of the US. His dad goes and polls all the other doctors about polygenesis, and they're like, yeah, it seems about right. That's what we think. So there is some evidence of kind of ground level, more theoretical conversations happening where doctors are looked to as the local scientific experts. And then also where, I mean, I think more broadly in discussing courses of treatment that comes out as well. And then the race mixing and passing question is actually very interesting. Well, not actually, but of course is very interesting. So there were freedom suits during this period where people were suing on the basis that they were white. And there are a couple of cases. Well, there's one case, and I saw a graduate student recently present on this, where a black doctor, one of the few black doctors in the country, or trained, MD trained black doctors, he went to, trained in Europe. He was served as a witness to argue that this man was not, was white and should not be enslaved. And then the other side had their own expert who argued that he was, and believe it or not, the white court sided with the doctors arguing that he should be enslaved. But more broadly, I've actually seen a medical student in Maryland who went to Penn just after he graduated from Penn, wrote back to his professor asking how to identify somebody as black who has white skin, and asking for tips because this man was suing for slander because somebody else had called him the N-word. So he wanted to sue for slander, and he had to define whether or not it was slander. So that idea of a medical expert as being able to be called into court and to define your race was emerging in this period. And then on the other point of mostly medical schools, up until the end of my period, were not admitting people of African descent, and they were very rare when they did. So Dartmouth was the first school in, I think, late 1830s, and they admitted a Liberian American student, and he actually had to steal black bodies for his medical education, which I talk about. And then there was a couple of black students admitted to Harvard for 1 year, and then the white students protested and rebelled, and they stopped admitting them after that 1 year, and that was in 1850. And there's also a case in South Carolina on this kind of passing issue where the local licensing organization gave a man a medical license to practice, and then revoked it once they had heard that he might have a non-white inheritance. So they were certainly defining, or there are certainly very clear cases, and I think more broadly though of this defining the other as a part of defining whiteness. There are, I mean, these power dynamics of white masculine spaces, and I very much think of the medical school in this period as a place where white men come around in homosocial activities, steal people of color's bodies, they make jokes about them. So that they're defining kind of their whiteness through that power over people of color. And then also in this climatological issue, they're associating whiteness with the tundra, and like, or not the tundra, but with temperate zones in Europe. So there's a kind of Atlantic Europeanness tied to concepts of health and the environment. And they also argued that enslaved people were, because of their work, were immune to indigestion, and that white people, like this is, this disease of civilization is indigestion, which, based on the wonderful food and relaxing we've been having in Mexico, it seems, may be true on at least the disease of comfort. But so they're very much kind of, these do exist in very much in binaries, or even more complicated when we bring in how they talk about other racial groups. National instruments, I'm trying to think of that study brace.
Racialized bodies suppose that necessarily, in Mexico, for example, like specific instruments to analyze them, For example, in gynecology, how do you call it in English?
Mm-hmm.
The instruments that came from Europe were supposed not to measure correctly.
Oh.
Bodies, because they were a different race. So we need specific Mexican instruments made here for Mexican bodies. So and in that way, indirectly, this science about birth and this gynecological science was key to define a national science in the midterm.
So,
I don't know if that kind of processes were happening at the same time.
yes and no, I guess would be so there is actually Samuel Cartwright, who Urmi mentioned, created, it's still actually used, called a spirometer that measures your breath. And so that's an example of, I think, where that's very much happening in the US. One of the things, though, in the chapter I push back a little bit against is that there is this argument that American bodies need to be treated differently, but I argue that that's a theoretical shift that's more consistent internationally, is that French physicians are arguing for the need of specificity in the Mediterranean. So while it's a need for kind of a specific national medicine, there's a universal shift in a more, at least an Atlantic world medical culture towards local and nationalized medicine. So I think it's both a very, yes. Yes, and so much of the U.S. Historians have really kind of, they treat the South as a very provincial place, and they call it states' rights medicine, which states' rights was this justification for secession. So it's like very dismissive of it, and so what I'm trying to show is that these Southern physicians are actually working from a very cosmopolitan frame to justify their nationalistic medicine, rather than thinking of themselves as separated from a larger theoretical project of nation building. But that's it, yes, it's very, and I'd love to hear more about what's happening in Mexico, and so thank you, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. And I just have one question that I recall when I was listening to Emily's questions, and I guess you didn't answer that question, and about the uses of different localities and different geographies of knowledge, and the creation of knowledge in different geographies, and how Emily told you that in Mexico we think that Mexico, Latin America in general, and other spaces like Africa is used like a laboratory, and how do you frame your research within this, the southern part of the U.S. working as a laboratory inside the U.S. I mean, for these MDs that were working in these universities. And the other question is that one that I am trying to, we were talking about yesterday about, and you are framing your research between these two origin narratives about about man and about the races, polygenist and monogenist. Okay, so was that narrative very important to the MDs that were using, that were practicing medicine in the U.S.? I mean, because what we were talking about Nancy Stepan yesterday about the way she uses the explanatory power of the of neo-Lamarckism as an explanation of why Latin America is an eugenical country. It's are eugenical. They have the eugenical narratives. So the question here is the same. So what if the doctors are using those narratives of origin in the racial science, or they are just, or is it that more your vision or your explanation of that? I mean, was that used or not used by them? And also for Urmi and you, and I don't know if we have time to answer that, is that you have talked about more or less, you talk, I think, more about the admixture of races and between black and white. But how were the bodies of the Native American people were understood in both narratives in between, for example, for the doctors that you were studying in your thesis and your dissertations, because they seem absent in those narratives. And the question connects with the way we understand. For example, we are in Mexico. We have a great deal of indigenous population. So the indigenous population, Native Americans, are always present in our problems, in our narratives of medicine, or history of science, whatever. We are always trying to understand the Native American indigenous populations in Mexico. So it seems that in the 19th century, they don't exist in those narratives that you are proposing. So what do you have to answer about that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Suel. Thank you again for having us. So I will say, well, I think one thing that's interesting is the United States also viewed Africa as a laboratory, and also were kind of simultaneously imagining their own version of Africa to mix with their racial stereotypes of black people. But to what extent was the South a laboratory for the U.S. medical profession, I think is a really interesting question. I think at least one way that I've identified where the South did operate as a laboratory was in ethical issues of the types of things you could do to enslave people and the types of treatments you could do to enslave people that you could not do on white people. So in the medical student dissertations, that would be life-threatening physiological trials for no therapeutic purpose that I've never seen, I've never seen in the US done on white people, and the only Atlantic world case, the doctors faced criminal charges, and this was in Paris, where some doctors deliberately infected patients with syphilis in the 1850s. And I came across a student who deliberately infected an enslaved person with measles to see how the disease was transmitted. And it turns out, of course, that when you inject somebody with measles-infected blood, they get measles. And another local doctor he mentioned in his thesis had done a similar experiment with scarlet fever. So I think in that way, you could never very publicly do that on a white person. And there are other similar trials that I found. And then more famously, surgical experimentation was going on a lot on plantations. So the first successful cesarean sections, maybe this also speaks to your earlier question, cesarean sections were done in Louisiana. J. Marion Sims' radical cure surgical cure for vesicovaginal fistulas were done on operations on enslaved women that he rented, and he failed about 25 times on each woman before he succeeded. So he did, dozens of failed surgeries that I don't think, well, their voices are lost, and some crazy racist doctors have tried to argue they consented. I can't imagine anybody consenting to dozens of failed surgical experiments on their genitals. So I think, especially on surgical cases, but there were no ethical rules around slavery. I mean, there were very little ethical rules about experimentation in general, but I think a common sense white supremacist ethics tended to pervade. And then and I think, so what I think is important about putting polygenesis in conversation with medicine is not so much a causal narrative, not that like polygenesis caused racial narratives, but so much that they're in a moment where these two disciplines are linked. So I wouldn't pretend, I don't think that polygenesis causes this racial medicine. I would say that type of intellectual history is somewhat, way oversimplified, whereas it's a moment where bodies are being reimagined across a couple of disciplines that are deeply in conversation with each other. And the people who are framing the medical discourses are often framing the racial science discourses and teaching them to their students, if that makes sense. So to the average doctor, I think most of them, this is what I think I was trying to get at with my answer about how does it look in theses. Most of them are interested in the best ways to treat yellow fever. So thinking about inherited races is a way of thinking about yellow fever, or how much to bleed somebody, or thinking about how to manage hundreds of enslaved people and their medical treatment. So the way these discourses, I would say they're mutually informative rather than causally one caused the other, if that answers your question. And then Native Americans that's a very interesting question, because that's very much a part of the popular discourse, but not as much a part of the medical discourse. So Samuel Morton collected a lot of Native American crania, and they were very much fascinated with flat-headed Indians. So Native Americans who kind of reshaped their skulls in Peru, the Caribbean, and then the Pacific Northwest. They didn't talk about them as much if they did, but and so they were very much interested in Native Americans in a pure racial science lens, but because most doctors weren't going to treat Native Americans, they didn't discuss it, and I've never seen a great deal of fear about admixture because there's not a great deal of intimacy between white people and Native Americans in at least the east coast of the eastern half of the U.S. So whereas, planters are raping their slaves and birthing children, there's a very immediate fear of mixed race children, and not to mention that it undercuts the whole ideological position of white supremacy, and they believe that disgust for other races was a proof of racial difference. So if planters are not so disgusted as to, but there's a lot of kind of what we think of proto-anthropological obsession with Native Americans, maybe even more than people of African descent, and more exoticization of them in anthropological discourses, but it does not inform the medical education as much, so it's not as heavily a part of my study, if that makes sense, except for more in the chapters on skull collecting, because they fetishized the skulls, but they weren't talking about metastahe in that context.
Ok, creo que ya nos vamos. Muchas gracias por su participación y muchas gracias. Thank you very much for being here. Gracias. Aplauso, un aplauso.